and I'm going to try to take out my opponent from the back and do as much damage as I possibly can. All too often too, players don't realize about these backdoor rocks. Build a building there so you can see when those rocks are getting taken out. So we're about to see right now if my opponent Terran realizes what's about to happen. It looks like he does have a Banshee here, so he now realizes that there is a party of Marines Marauders up here, but wisely he has a couple of tanks as well, so I'm not actually in a good position to risk my forces there. Not with tanks, because obviously tanks just annihilate clumped armies of Marines and Marauders. So I am actually going to fall back, but notice I am actually going to grab this central command center, and this actually puts a bit more pressure on both me and my opponent, because now I'm kind of, hey, I'm in your face building a command center right behind you. And so for me, I have to defend not only my natural, but also this area at the back. And my opponent has to worry about an attack from not only the front, but also his back. So it kind of makes the game a lot more interesting. And of course, this is all going along the line, the thought process of being unexpected, doing things that your opponent wouldn't expect, and then trying to capitalize on that. So I am trying to just build up my army as usual. I now have my command center at the middle position on the top. As you guys can see, I actually have quite a bit of gas here. I've got a pretty hefty reserve of minerals and gas, and that's nice. You're gonna want to use that gas later on, because obviously gas is the most valuable resource in Terran versus Terran. And I do want to try to max out my army as quickly as possible, getting up to 200. Note, all my production facilities in the center, easily accessible. My hotkey 4 controls every single production facility, all my barracks, all my factories, all my starports, and I simply use tab to cycle through the buildings when I'm building with my hotkey. So I push 4, AAA for Marines, and tab, SSS for tanks, tab, DDD for dropships. So it's very, very easy, very methodical. It's a nice way to macro your forces out quickly and efficiently. Note, I do have Thors coming as well. You guys just heard the epic chant from the Thor. The Thor is here, and it looks like my opponent does have the Xel'Naga Watchtower. So I realize that my opponent has some forces in the center. I'm going to leave a couple of my tanks at the natural as before, but I am starting to push forward to try to apply some pressure towards the backside of my opponent's main. And the reason for this, really, hey, I'm in a good position. I've got a lot of tanks to fall back to. And remember, all you have to do, I don't have to waste comsat, I just move my dropships in and my tanks get vision. So that's all I have to do. Just use one dropship, or even use 4. I guess I was too lazy here to split them up. But you only really need to use a couple of dropships. You can move them in, and you can scout the high ground with your tanks. And then your tanks will get the ability to shell slowly but surely. So notice I am pushing another tank forward here. I was about to comsat, but I realized, no, don't need to do that. Just move the dropship in. And so my dropship right there has the additional range over my opponent's tank, because he doesn't have an air unit to spot for the tank. And so I'm going to be able to slowly but surely push my opponent back. Now, when you're in this situation too, you do have to be careful, because any small micro mismanagement can cost you a large amount of forces. You don't want to, like I said right there, stimming your forces and running them in can be suicidal when there's a ton of tanks, especially when there's that narrow choked off ramp, so you don't really want to run up there. The best situation right now is just stay planted and stay put. You don't need to be aggressive because you have the low ground, you don't have the terrain advantage. Just stay there and build another command center somewhere else on the map. So as you guys can see at my natural, I have another orbital command coming. I don't know if you guys spotted that, but it's building from an SCV. It's actually a command center. And what you can do is try to use some dropship play. So I have a couple of dropships loaded up right here with Marines. My opponent has his entire army, it looks like, inside his main. So now's the perfect time, couldn't ask for any better, to move a couple of dropships around the backside of my opponent's main and drop some Marines off into the natural and do some economic damage. So here we go, my dropships are on the way right now. Noting that I'm using the shift Q to move my dropships around the backside of my opponent's base. I'm gonna go ahead and just drop them right inside the mineral line, but lo and behold, holy crap, there are battlecruisers there. So this is where I was just kind of standing in shock and awe, and I was like, whoa, 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 my opponent's building BCs. And that's actually quite a few battlecruisers. So whenever you're in this situation, you gotta think, what's the unit to get to deal with battlecruisers? And the answer is the Viking. The Viking is the most powerful anti-air unit that the Terrans are capable of fielding, and you need to get Vikings as quickly as possible. So what you need to do is build a bunch of starports, put all reactor cores on them, and just start mass pumping Vikings out of those starports. So you guys can see right now, starports are on the way, Vikings are on the way. Looks like my dropships before they died did scout the fact that my opponent has a bunch of bases towards the south, so I realized I'm actually kind of far behind here, and I still don't have a way to deal with these BCs, and they're starting to threaten their way forward. Unfortunately, Thors don't do very good damage against battlecruisers at all because battlecruisers are not considered light, so I really don't have much to hold off against these BCs. I need to buy time to build up a larger force of Vikings if I want to be able to hold this off. So right now it's all about buying time. Remember, I have a bunch of starports with reactors. I'm trying to build as many Vikings as possible out of those starports. My opponent has a pesky Marine at my new expansion, so I'm going to try to take that out. And right now, it's all about being super careful. Notice my Marines are just barely out of range of my opponent's tanks, and that's the way I want to keep them. That's really all the anti-air I have right now. A couple of Vikings. My tanks are starting to go down. My turrets never actually went up. And finally, I decided, okay, it's time. Let's push forward. Let's take out these BCs. They look pretty weak, and it looks like I'm going to be able to take out the last battlecruiser, but at a very, very huge cost. I'm losing the majority of my army, and now my opponent's tank and marine force is starting to push forward. And really, here's where you want to fall back into your planetary fortress. Remember, Terrans, their greatest asset is their static ability to be defensive. Planetary fortress, siege tanks, all of this really comes in handy. It looks like I misjudged right there. I was actually pulling all my SCVs thinking there was only 3 tanks, but there was actually about 3 more in the back, and that actually destroyed about 20 of my SCVs. And that right there was a huge and costly mistake. My opponent right now gaining a huge advantage, even though I picked off the majority of his BCs. He now has a very, very large advantage, shelling my third. I don't really have, I do have another expansion up, but there's no saturation there whatsoever. Gonna try to remedy that with some mules, which, remember, mules are, they come in handy. That's why Terrans are so darn good when it comes to not having SCVs. They can just meal up. I did pull all my tanks back that were defending against that lone Marine, and now I can finally siege up, but unfortunately, I lose my planetary fortress. And so that was a huge loss for me. Now down to 3 base versus my opponent's seemingly 4 base. But one advantage I have here, I can try to eke this out. I have air control, I have my Vikings. I'm going to try to pick off my opponent's battlecruisers, as well as his lone Viking, pulling the Vikings back, which are in the red. This is all basic elementary micro, but it comes in handy because it keeps your army larger and alive. Although it doesn't look like it mattered because I lost the Vikings anyways, the 2 that were in the red. But I realize right now, wow, I'm actually in a really horrible spot because my opponent has, it looks like 5 bases. I just lost my top side expansion after a grueling battle. It was back and forth. We were basically shelling each other, trying to get every inch of terrain, but my opponent was able to push forward when he surprised me with the BCs. And so if you're in this spot, really all you're left to is going all in with the forces you have, or trying to double expand and playing out a longer term game. So I decided, alright, let's go for double expansion. Let's try to out macro my opponent. I have 2 more expansions going out at the 5 o'clock and the inside 6 o'clock position. My opponent bringing in Marines, he stimmed them, and I was able to pull my SCVs, my harvesters away, and looks like I was able to keep them from dying. So that all really does help and come into play, keeping my economy losses to a minimum and allowing me to play a longer term game. Because remember, every SCV really counts right now after I've gone for this double expansion. It doesn't mean much if you have all these command centers but you don't have any saturation to get the economy rolling. So right now it looks like I am going to just start to transfer my workers over, trying to get my mineral intake as high as possible. I've also loaded up the majority of my forces into my dropships. I realize, now's a good time to push forward. Most likely my opponent isn't building any more battle cruisers since I killed off the majority of his BCs. I can pick off this orbital command, which was an easy take for my tanks. And it looks like my opponent finally repositioning his forces. I'm going to go ahead and siege up. I have a pretty good advantage here, but more battle cruisers coming out. And this is where I realize, probably should have brought the Vikings with me. And so my opponent is going to be able to steamroll the rest of these tanks. And that obviously is not bueno, because now those VCs are, all my tanks are just going to go down before my Vikings can arrive in time. And so that's going to be a pretty hefty loss to me. But remember, the longer I can hold on, the more eco I've got rolling. I've got those 2 bases towards the south. I can hopefully try to pick off a couple of these battle cruisers. And remember, I still have a pretty sizable army at the center of the map. So all is not lost quite yet. Thank God for Mule right there, just mulling down about 5 or 6 mules. I just picked off a small engagement at the middle as well. And things, of course, just getting ever more frantic for my ragtag army of metal and bio. It looks like I still had 1 tank remaining in that drop to deflect those mining SCVs. And so both of us right now scrambling. I realized my opponent is actually not that far ahead in economy as I thought, because remember that bottom expansion had no saturation. So really my opponent is on 3 base, I'm on 5 base. So it doesn't look too bleak for me. I might be able to still eke out this game. It's still very, very close. Building up my army at the center. And it looks like my opponent is actually starting to push forward in the middle. So right here, what you want to do is siege up your tanks. A pretty sizable army of battlecruisers, but thankfully I've got a lot of Vikings this time that were saved up from building them all up out of my 3 reactor starports. And it looks like I'm going to be able to take out the entire army at the center. And my opponent is actually going to GG out of here. My opponent's name was Purity. And that was actually a little unexpected. When I saw the GG, I was like, whoa, really? I didn't think I was that far ahead. But you know, I kind of realized my opponent engaged in a very bad spot. He didn't get a nice siege with his tanks, and I was able actually to kill off his entire army without losing much at all. So that was a huge costly mistake when my opponent engaged at the center. You never want to push forward with a Terran army into a bunch of sieged up tanks unless you have a bunch of bio, unless you have a bunch of fodder units to push forward and absorb the damage from my own siege tanks. So that was a pretty bad mistake from my opponent, and thankfully I was actually able to win that game. That was an interesting TVT, very, very long and hard fought, and a lot of engagements all over the map, which really goes to show Terran versus Terran, a very strategic game. It's kind of like chess. I really do like it. StarCraft in general is like chess, but Terran versus Terran, very micro-oriented, very much about winning those small battles all around the map and positioning your army in the most favorable fashion. So I hope you guys enjoyed that broadcast. That was Daily Ladder number 20. And I hope we're going to have a Protoss game coming up next. And of course, we're going to have more pro games coming out soon. So I want to thank you guys all for tuning in. HD, signing out.